I never believed in ghosts. Not really. I was the kind of person who'd roll my eyes at horror movies, who'd laugh at friends when they told me about haunted houses or Ouija boards gone wrong. I liked the idea of the supernatural, sure, but only as a story, a way to pass the time on a rainy night. I was a skeptic, a rationalist, the kind of person who needed proof before I'd even consider the possibility of something beyond the ordinary. That's why, when I moved into the old house on Maple Street, I didn't think twice about the rumors. The neighbors whispered about strange noises, about lights flickering at odd hours, about shadows moving behind the curtains when no one was home. I chalked it up to old wiring, creaky floorboards, the kind of things you expect in a house built before the war. I was 24, fresh out of college, and the rent was cheap. That was all that mattered. The first few weeks were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, set up my furniture, and tried to make the place feel like home. The house was drafty, with high ceilings and narrow hallways, but I liked the character. There was a fireplace in the living room, a clawfoot tub in the bathroom, and a little attic space that I used for storage. It was the kind of place you could imagine raising a family in, if you ignored the peeling wallpaper and the occasional mouse in the walls. It started with the footsteps. I'd be lying in bed at night, half asleep, when I'd hear them, soft, deliberate, moving across the ceiling above me. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon that had found its way into the attic. But the footsteps were too regular, too human. They'd start at one end of the attic and move slowly, methodically, to the other. Sometimes they'd stop right above my bed, and I'd hold my breath, waiting for the sound to fade. It always did, eventually, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there, watching me. That I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just jumpy because I was living alone for the first time in my life. But the footsteps kept coming, night after night, always at the same time, 3:13 a.m. I started setting an alarm, just to see if I was dreaming, but every time I woke up, the footsteps were there, pacing back and forth above my head. One night, I decided to confront whatever was making the noise. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat and climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the room, half expecting to see a raccoon or a nest of mice. But the attic was empty, just boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. I checked every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing there. I felt foolish, standing in my pajamas with a bat in my hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The footsteps didn't come that night, or the next. I started to relax, thinking maybe I'd scared off whatever animal had been living up there. But then, a week later, I found the door to the attic open. I always kept it closed, locked with a little brass key that hung on a nail by the stairs. But that morning, the door was ajar, swinging gently in the draft. I checked the lock, but it was still in place, the key untouched. I told myself it was just the wind, that maybe I hadn't closed it properly the night before. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't true. Things got worse after that. I started hearing whispers, soft and indistinct, coming from the attic late at night. Sometimes I'd wake up to the sound of someone breathing, slow and ragged, just outside my bedroom door. I'd lie there, paralyzed, listening to the sound until it faded away. I stopped sleeping, started drinking too much coffee, trying to stay awake as long as I could. My friends noticed the bags under my eyes, the way I jumped at every little noise. I told them I was just stressed, that work was getting to me, but I could see the worry in their faces. One night, I woke up to the sound of something heavy dragging across the attic floor. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone pulling a trunk or a body across the boards. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened as the sound moved from one end of the attic to the other. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but I hung up before the call went through. What was I going to say? That my house was haunted? That there was a ghost in my attic? I knew how it would sound. Instead, I grabbed the bat and the flashlight and climbed the stairs again. The attic was colder than usual, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. I swept the flashlight across the room, and that's when I saw him. He was standing in the far corner, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. He was tall, impossibly thin, with long arms that hung at his sides like dead branches. His face was pale, almost translucent, with deep-set eyes that glowed in the beam of the flashlight. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with a look of infinite sadness. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, as he slowly raised one hand and pointed at me. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at him. It could have been seconds or hours. Eventually, I stumbled back down the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, pushed a chair against the handle, and sat on the floor, shaking. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, pale and mournful, staring at me from the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. But the next morning, I found muddy footprints on the attic stairs, leading down to my bedroom door. The footprints were too large to be mine, and they were fresh, the mud still wet. I cleaned them up, but they kept coming back, night after night, always leading from the attic to my room. I started seeing him everywhere, in the reflection of the bathroom mirror, in the shadows at the end of the hallway, in the corner of my eye when I was watching TV. He never moved, never spoke, just watched me with those sad, empty eyes. I stopped inviting friends over, stopped answering my phone. I was afraid that if I let anyone in, he'd follow them, too. I tried everything to get rid of him. I burned sage, sprinkled salt across the attic door, even called a priest to bless the house. Nothing worked. The footsteps kept coming, the whispers grew louder, and the man in the attic grew bolder. Sometimes I'd wake up to find him standing at the foot of my bed, his long arms reaching out for me. I'd scream, but no sound would come out. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced I was losing my mind. I started researching the history of the house, desperate for answers. I found old newspaper clippings about a man who'd lived there in the 1940s, a recluse who'd disappeared without a trace. The neighbors said he was strange, that he'd spent all his time in the attic, writing letters to someone who never wrote back. They found his body years later, hidden behind a false wall, his face twisted in a look of terror. The police said he'd died of natural causes, but the neighbors whispered about curses, about restless spirits who couldn't move on. I don't know if the man in the attic is the same man who died there all those years ago. I don't know if he's a ghost, a demon, or just a figment of my imagination. All I know is that he's real, and he's not going away. I've tried moving, tried leaving the house behind, but he follows me wherever I go. I see him in hotel rooms, in the back seat of my car, in the reflection of shop windows. He's always there, watching, waiting that I don't know what he wants. Maybe he's lonely, desperate for someone to notice him. Maybe he's angry, trapped in a world he can't escape. Or maybe he's just a shadow, a memory of something terrible that happened in that old house on Maple Street. All I know is that I'm not alone, and I never will be again. If you're listening to this, if you ever find yourself in an old house with creaky floorboards and a drafty attic, pay attention to the footsteps. Listen for the whispers, the soft breathing outside your door. And if you ever see a man with pale skin and sad eyes, don't look away. He's already seen you. I never thought much about mirrors. They were just part of the background, a tool for brushing my hair or checking my outfit before I left the house. I never understood why people covered them during storms or after someone died, like my grandmother used to do. She'd drape old sheets over every mirror in the house, muttering about spirits and bad luck. I always thought it was just superstition, a leftover from a time when people believed in things they couldn't see. I was a practical person, a science major, the kind of girl who needed evidence before I'd believe in anything out of the ordinary. But that changed the summer I turned 19. I was home from college, staying with my parents in the old house on Willow Lane. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever happened. My parents both worked long hours, so I spent most of my days alone, reading or scrolling through my phone. The house was big and drafty, with creaky floors and windows that rattled in the wind. I'd always found it comforting, a place where I could relax and be myself. But that summer, something changed. The house felt different, heavier, somehow, like the air was thick with secrets. It started with the bathroom mirror. I was brushing my teeth one night, half asleep, when I noticed something strange. My reflection didn't quite match my movements. It was subtle at first, a delay of a second or two, like a video buffering on a slow connection. I blinked, and my reflection blinked a moment later. I raised my hand, and the girl in the mirror hesitated before following suit. I laughed it off, blaming it on exhaustion or maybe a trick of the light. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that, I started avoiding the bathroom after dark, using the downstairs powder room instead. But the feeling followed me. Every mirror in the house seemed to watch me, the glass cold and unyielding. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting behind me, a flicker of something that wasn't quite right. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my grandmother's stories get to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was soft, almost musical, like someone singing a lullaby just out of earshot. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from the hallway, from the direction of the upstairs bathroom. I grabbed my phone and crept down the hall, the floorboards groaning under my feet. The door to the bathroom was ajar, and the light was on, even though I knew I'd turned it off before bed. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the whispering grew louder, echoing off the tile walls. I turned to the mirror, and that's when I saw her. She looked like me, but not quite. Her hair was longer, tangled and wet, as if she'd just stepped out of the rain. Her eyes were darker, almost black, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. She smiled at me, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach her eyes. I stared at her, frozen, as she raised her hand and pressed it against the glass. I felt a cold chill run through me, like ice water in my veins that I stumbled back, knocking over a bottle of shampoo. The sound broke the spell, and when I looked again, the mirror was empty, just my own reflection, wide-eyed and terrified. I ran back to my room and locked the door, heart racing. I didn't sleep that night, or the next that I tried to tell my parents, but they just laughed it off. "You've always had an active imagination," my mom said, ruffling my hair. "Maybe you're just stressed from school." I wanted to believe her, but the feeling of being watched never went away. I started covering the mirrors with towels, just like my grandmother used to do. It helped, a little, but I could still feel her presence, lurking just beyond the glass. A week later, things escalated. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my hair in front of the vanity in my room. I'd forgotten to cover the mirror, and as I looked up, I saw her again. This time, she was closer, her face pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the surface. She mouthed something, her lips moving silently, but I couldn't make out the words. I reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the mirror. The glass was ice cold, and for a moment, I felt her hand on mine, thin, bony fingers curling around my wrist. I yanked my hand back and stumbled away, knocking over the chair. The mirror cracked, a thin spiderweb of lines radiating from the spot where our hands had met. I stared at it, my heart pounding, as a single drop of water trickled down the glass. After that, I started seeing her everywhere. In the reflection of the microwave door, in the window of my car, even in the screen of my phone when it was turned off. She was always there, watching me, her dark eyes unblinking. Sometimes she'd smile, a slow, predatory grin that made my skin crawl. Other times, she'd just stare, her face twisted in an expression of longing or hunger. I couldn't tell which. I stopped leaving the house, stopped answering my friends' texts. I was afraid that if I let anyone in, she'd find a way out. I spent my days hiding in my room, the mirrors covered, the curtains drawn. But at night, the whispering would start again, soft and insistent, calling me to the bathroom, to the vanity, to any surface that could reflect her image. I started researching, desperate for answers. I found stories online about mirror spirits, about doppelgangers and shadow people. Some said you could banish them with salt or sage. Others said you had to break every mirror in the house. I tried everything, burning incense, chanting prayers, even smashing the bathroom mirror with a hammer. But nothing worked. The more I tried to get rid of her, the stronger she seemed to become. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed. She wasn't in the mirror this time. She was in my room, her hair dripping water onto the carpet, her eyes fixed on mine. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She leaned over me, her breath cold against my cheek, and whispered something in my ear. I don't remember what she said, but the words echoed in my mind for days afterward, a constant, nagging presence that I couldn't shake. After that, I started losing time. I'd wake up in strange places, on the bathroom floor, in the hallway, even outside in the backyard, barefoot and shivering. My parents grew worried, but I couldn't tell them what was happening. How could I explain that I was being haunted by my own reflection? The final straw came one night when I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, a shard of glass in my hand. I didn't remember picking it up, didn't remember walking down the hall. I stared at my reflection, at the girl with the dark eyes and the wet hair, and for a moment, I didn't know which one of us was real. I pressed the shard against my palm, watching as a thin line of blood welled up and trickled down my wrist. The girl in the mirror smiled, her teeth sharp and white, and I dropped the glass, stumbling back in terror. I knew then that I had to leave. I packed a bag and left the house that night, driving for hours until I reached my aunt's place in the next state. I didn't tell her what had happened, just said I needed a place to stay for a while. She didn't ask questions, just hugged me and made up the guest room that it's been months now, and I still see her sometimes, in the rearview mirror, in the reflection of a store window, in the dark screen of my laptop. She's always there, just out of reach, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't know what she wants, or why she chose me. All I know is that I can never go home again. That if you're listening to this, if you ever notice your reflection moving just a little too slowly, or see something in the mirror that shouldn't be there, don't ignore it. Cover your mirrors, keep the lights on, and whatever you do, don't let her in. I grew up in a small town in northern Michigan, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and the woods press in on all sides. My parents owned a little cabin on the edge of a lake, surrounded by dense forest. I spent most of my childhood exploring those woods, building forts, climbing trees, and pretending I was the last survivor in a world overrun by monsters. The forest was my playground, my sanctuary, a place where I felt safe and free. That changed the summer I turned 16. It was the hottest summer I could remember. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that made your clothes stick to your skin and your hair curl in the heat. My parents were both working long hours, so I had the run of the place. I'd spend my days swimming in the lake, reading on the porch, or wandering the trails that wound through the trees. Sometimes my friends would come over, and we'd camp out in the backyard, telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows over the fire pit. One night, my friend Tyler and I decided to camp deeper in the woods, away from the house and the safety of the porch lights. We packed our sleeping bags, a couple of flashlights, and enough snacks to last us until morning. We hiked about a mile into the forest, following a narrow trail that twisted between the trees. The air was cooler under the canopy, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant call of an owl. We found a small clearing and set up camp. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the trees formed a tight circle around us, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of a giant beast. We built a small fire and sat around it, talking about school, girls, and what we wanted to do after graduation. The night was peaceful, the kind of night that makes you forget the world outside even exists. Around midnight, we heard the first voice. It was faint, almost lost in the rustle of the leaves. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a low, mournful sound, like someone calling for help. Tyler and I looked at each other, our faces pale in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. We listened, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. The voice came again, closer this time, a single word drawn out and desperate. "Help!" We stood up, shining our flashlights into the trees. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trunks and branches. The voice called out again, and this time, it sounded like a child. "Please help me." Tyler wanted to go back to the house, but I was stubborn. I told him it was probably just someone playing a prank, maybe one of the neighborhood kids trying to scare us. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. There was something wrong about the voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We decided to investigate, moving slowly through the trees, our flashlights sweeping back and forth. The voice led us deeper into the woods, always just out of sight, always just a little farther ahead. We called out, asking if anyone was there, but the only answer was the echo of our own voices. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into another clearing. The moon was high overhead, casting long shadows across the ground. In the center of the clearing stood a little girl, no older than 8 or 9. She was wearing a white dress, stained with dirt and blood, and her hair hung in tangled knots around her face. She looked up at us, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Help me," she whispered. That I took a step forward, but Tyler grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Something's wrong," he hissed. "We need to go." But I couldn't move. The girl's eyes held me in place, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. She took a step toward us, her bare feet silent on the forest floor. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "He's coming." Before I could react, the woods exploded with noise. Branches snapped, and something huge crashed through the trees behind us. Tyler screamed, and I turned to see a figure looming in the darkness, a man, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and hungry. We ran. I don't remember how we made it back to the camp, or how we found the trail that led to the house. All I remember is the sound of footsteps behind us, heavy and relentless, and the girl's voice echoing in my ears. When we finally burst out of the woods and into the backyard, the house was dark and silent. We pounded on the door until my dad let us in, his face pale with worry. We tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. He told us it was just a nightmare, that we'd let our imaginations get the best of us. But I knew it was real. The next day, Tyler refused to talk about what had happened. He left early, and I didn't see him for weeks. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, but the memory lingered, sharp and vivid. I started having nightmares, dreams of the girl in the clearing, of the man in the woods, of voices calling to me from the darkness. That a few nights later, I heard the voice again. This time, it was outside my window, soft and pleading. Help me." I looked out, but the yard was empty. The woods pressed close, their shadows deep and impenetrable. I closed the curtains and tried to sleep, but the voice kept calling, growing louder and more insistent. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. A flash of white in the trees, a shadow moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. My parents noticed the change in me, the way I jumped at every sound, the way I refused to go outside after dark. I tried to tell them, but they just shook their heads, telling me I was too old for ghost stories. One night, I woke up to find the girl standing at the foot of my bed. She was soaked with blood, her eyes hollow and empty. She reached out to me, her fingers cold and wet. "Help me," she whispered. I screamed, and my parents came running. But by the time they turned on the light, she was gone. After that, I couldn't stay in the house. I begged my parents to let me stay with my aunt in the city, and they finally agreed. I left the next day, leaving behind the woods, the lake, and the memories that haunted me. That it's been years since that summer, but I still hear the voices sometimes, soft and distant, calling to me from the edge of sleep. I don't know what happened in those woods, or who the girl was, or what the thing that chased us really wanted. All I know is that some places are better left unexplored, and some voices should never be answered. If you ever find yourself alone in the woods at night, and you hear someone calling for help, don't follow. No matter how desperate they sound, no matter how lost or afraid they seem, don't go looking. Some things are meant to stay in the dark. I never thought I'd end up living alone in the city. I'd always imagined myself surrounded by friends, maybe a roommate or two, laughter echoing down the hallways, the comfort of knowing someone else was there. But life doesn't always work out the way you plan. After my breakup, I needed a fresh start, so I found a tiny studio apartment in an old building downtown. It was nothing special, just a single room with a kitchenette, a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in, and a window that looked out over the alley. But it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The building was old, the kind of place with creaky floors and radiators that clanged in the night. My neighbors kept to themselves, and the halls always smelled faintly of dust and something sweet, like old perfume. The landlord was a quiet man in his 60s, always shuffling around with a ring of keys and a tired smile. He told me the building had been apartments since the 1920s and that most of the tenants had lived there for years. I liked the idea of history, of being part of something that had lasted so long. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, right above a unit that had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. The door was always locked, the windows dark. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear noises from below, footsteps, the scrape of furniture, the faint sound of music drifting up through the floorboards. I figured it was just the building settling, or maybe the pipes rattling in the walls. I never thought much of it. That changed about a month after I moved in. It started with the knocking. At first, it was just a soft tap, tap, tap on the floor, always around midnight. I'd be lying in bed, half asleep, when I'd hear it, 3 slow knocks, then silence. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old building making noise. But the knocking kept coming, night after night, always at the same time. One night, I decided to investigate. I got out of bed, pulled on a sweater, and crept down the stairs to the 2nd floor. The hallway was dark and silent, the only light coming from the exit sign at the end of the corridor. I stood outside the door to the empty apartment, listening. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from inside, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving from one end of the room to the other. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no answer. I tried the handle, but it was locked tight. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sign of movement, but the apartment was silent. I went back upstairs, but I couldn't sleep. The knocking started again, louder this time. echoing up through the floorboards. I put in earplugs, buried my head under the pillow, but the sound found its way in, a steady, insistent rhythm that kept me awake until dawn. The next morning, I went to see the landlord. I told him about the noises, about the knocking and the footsteps. He just shrugged, his eyes tired and distant. "That apartment's been empty for years," he said. "No one's lived there since Mrs. Callahan passed away." I asked him who Mrs. Callahan was, but he just shook his head and walked away. I started asking around, talking to the other tenants. Most of them didn't want to talk about the apartment below. Some said it was cursed, that bad things happened to anyone who tried to live there. Others just looked away, their faces pale and drawn. One old woman, Mrs. Green, told me that Mrs. Callahan had lived there for decades, all alone after her husband died. She was a quiet woman, kept to herself, but sometimes people would hear her talking to someone late at night, even though no one ever saw anyone visit. "They found her in the bathtub," Mrs. Green whispered, her voice trembling. "She'd been dead for days before anyone noticed. They say she still wanders the halls, looking for someone to talk to." I laughed it off, but the story stuck with me. That night, the knocking started again, louder than ever. I sat up in bed, staring at the floor, my heart racing. I could hear footsteps, the scrape of a chair, the faint sound of someone humming an old song. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the sounds were too real, too persistent that a few nights later, I woke up to the sound of someone crying. It was a soft, broken sob, drifting up through the floorboards. I lay there, listening, my chest tight with fear. The crying went on for hours, rising and falling like the tide. I wanted to go downstairs to see if someone needed help, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in my bed by a fear I couldn't explain. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. The paper was old and yellowed, the handwriting shaky and uneven. "Please help me. I'm so lonely." I stared at the note, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. I showed it to the landlord, but he just frowned and said it was probably a prank. I wanted to believe him, but the fear in his eyes told me he didn't believe it himself. That night, the knocking started again, but this time it was different. It was faster, more urgent, like someone pounding on the door. I got out of bed and went to the window, looking down at the alley below. The street was empty, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp. I turned away, and that's when I saw her. She was standing in the corner of my room, her hair wet and tangled, her eyes wide and desperate. She wore a faded nightgown, stained with something dark. She reached out to me, her fingers trembling. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me alone." I stumbled back, my heart racing. She vanished, leaving only the faint scent of old perfume in the air. After that, I started seeing her everywhere, in the hallway, in the reflection of the bathroom mirror, in the shadows at the edge of my vision. She never spoke, never moved, just watched me with those sad, empty eyes that I tried to move out. But every time I packed my bags, something would go wrong. The elevator would break down, the landlord would lose my paperwork, or I'd get sick and have to stay in bed. It was like the building itself didn't want me to leave. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. My friends stopped visiting, scared off by the stories I told them. I was alone, trapped in that tiny apartment with the ghost of a woman who just wanted someone to talk to. One night, I woke up to find her sitting on the edge of my bed. She reached out and took my hand, her touch cold and gentle. "Thank you," she whispered. "I just needed someone to listen." The next morning, the knocking stopped. The footsteps faded away, and the apartment below was silent. I moved out a week later, leaving behind the city, the building, and the memories that haunted me. I don't know if Mrs. Callahan found peace, or if she's still wandering the halls, looking for someone to talk to. All I know is that sometimes the dead just want to be heard. If you ever find yourself living above an empty apartment, and you hear someone knocking late at night, don't ignore it. Listen, you might be the only one who can. I grew up in a rural town where the nights were so dark you could see every star in the sky. Our house sat at the very end of a long gravel road, surrounded by cornfields and woods that seemed to go on forever. My parents liked the quiet, the privacy, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just us and the land. But for me, the isolation always felt a little uneasy, like we were living on the edge of something vast and unknowable. That I was 17 the summer it happened. My older brother had just left for college, and I was alone in the house with my parents, who both worked late shifts at the hospital in town. Most nights, I'd be by myself until well after midnight. The only sounds the hum of the fridge and the distant chorus of frogs and crickets outside. I'd gotten used to it, or at least I thought I had, until the night I saw the shadow at the end of the road. It was a Friday, late July, and the air was thick with the smell of rain. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when the power flickered and went out. I wasn't scared. Power outages were common during summer storms, but the silence that followed was absolute. No hum of the fridge, no whir of the ceiling fan, just the sound of my own breathing and the distant rumble of thunder. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, hoping to see if the neighbors' lights were out too. But as I looked down the long stretch of gravel road, I saw something that made my skin crawl. At the very end of the road, just where the cornfields began, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, almost impossibly so, and it didn't move. The beam of my flashlight didn't reach that far, but the shape was unmistakable. A person, or something like a person, standing perfectly still in the darkness that I watched for a long time, waiting for it to move, to step forward or turn away. But it just stood there, as if it were waiting for me to notice. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a scarecrow or a tree stump I'd never noticed before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that it knew I was alone. The power came back on a few minutes later, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. I tried to laugh it off, but that night, I locked every door and window before I went to bed. I left the hallway light on, just in case. The next night, the power went out again, right around midnight. I went to the window, heart pounding, and there it was, the shadow, standing at the end of the road, closer this time. I could see it more clearly now, the way it seemed to absorb the light around it, a darkness deeper than the night itself. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, waiting. I called my parents, but their phones went straight to voicemail. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That there was a shadow standing at the end of my driveway? I knew how it would sound that I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with the lights on, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Every so often, I'd check the window, and the shadow would still be there, unmoving, unblinking. The next morning, I walked down the road to where I'd seen it. There was nothing there, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was seeing things in the dark. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Over the next week, the shadow kept coming back. Sometimes it would be at the end of the road, sometimes halfway up the driveway, always a little closer than before. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, too afraid to close my eyes. I started seeing it during the day, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shape standing in the field, gone when I looked straight at it. One night, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching outside my window. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw the shadow standing at the edge of the yard, closer than it had ever been. I could see its outline now, the way it seemed to shimmer and shift, as if it were made of smoke. I watched as it raised one long arm and pointed at the house. I screamed, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in my own skin, as the shadow drifted closer, gliding across the grass without a sound. It stopped just outside my window, its face, or what should have been its face, pressed against the glass. I couldn't see any features, just a void, a darkness that seemed to swallow the light that I don't remember what happened next. I must have passed out, because when I woke up, it was morning and the shadow was gone. But the feeling of dread lingered, a weight pressing down on my chest that I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me. They said I was just stressed, that I needed to get out of the house more. But I knew what I'd seen. I started researching, looking for stories about shadows, about things that followed people home. I found forums full of people who'd seen the same thing, shapes in the dark, figures that watched from the edge of the woods, shadows that crept closer every night. Some said you could get rid of them by ignoring them, by refusing to acknowledge their presence. Others said you had to confront them, to stand your ground and show no fear. I tried both, but nothing worked. The shadow kept coming, always closer, always watching. One night, I decided to leave. I packed a bag and waited until dawn, then drove to my friend's house in town. I stayed there for a week, sleeping on her couch, trying to forget what I'd seen. But even there, the feeling of being watched never left me. I'd catch glimpses of the shadow in the hallway, in the reflection of the TV screen, in the darkness outside the window. Eventually, I went back home. My parents were worried, but I couldn't tell them the truth. I tried to go back to normal, but the shadow was always there, lurking at the edge of my vision. I started seeing it in my dreams, standing at the end of the road, waiting for me to come outside. The last time I saw it was the night before I left for college. I was packing my things when the power went out again. I went to the window, and there it was, standing in the middle of the yard, closer than ever. It raised its arm and pointed at me, and for the first time, I felt something like understanding, a message, silent and clear. You can never leave. I turned away, refusing to look at it, and the power came back on. When I looked again, the yard was empty. I haven't seen the shadow since I left home, but sometimes, late at night, I feel its presence, a weight in the darkness, a chill in the air. I don't know what it wanted or why it chose me. All I know is that some things follow you, no matter how far you run. If you ever see a shadow standing at the end of your road, don't look at it. Don't acknowledge it. And whatever you do, don't let it in.